What an extraordinary time this was! Krimov felt that history had left the pages of books and come to life. Here in Stalingrad, the glitter of sunlight on water, the colour of the sky and the clouds struck him with a new intensity. It had been the same when he was a child. The patter of summer rain, a rainbow, his first glimpse of snow had been enough to fill him with happiness. Now he had rediscovered this sense of wonder, something nearly all of us lose as we come to take the miracle of our lives for granted. Everything Krimov had disliked in the life of these last years, everything he had found false, seemed absent from Stalingrad. Yes, this is how it was in Lenin's day, he said to himself. He felt that people were treating him differently, better than they had done before the war. It was the same now as when he had been encircled by the Germans. He no longer felt that he was a stepson of the age. Recently, on the left bank, he had been preparing his talks and lectures with enthusiasm, quite reconciled to his new role. Nevertheless, there were times when he did feel a sense of humiliation. Why hadn't he been allowed to continue as a fighting commissar? He had done his job well enough, better than many others. There was something good about the relations between people here. There was a true sense of dignity and equality on this clay slope where so much blood had been spilt. There was an almost universal interest in such matters as the structure of kolkhozes after the war, the future relations between the great peoples and their governments. The day-to-day life of these soldiers, their work with spades, with the kitchen knives they used for cleaning potatoes, the cobbler's knives they used for mending boots, seemed to have a direct bearing on their life after the war, even on the lives of other nations and states. Nearly everyone believed that good would triumph, that honest men, who hadn't hesitated to sacrifice their lives, would be able to build a good and just life. This faith was all the more touching in that these men thought that they themselves would be unlikely to survive until the end of the war. Indeed, they felt astonished each evening to have survived one more day. After his evening lecture, Krimov was taken to Batyuk's bunker. Lieutenant Colonel Batyuk, a short man whose face expressed all the weariness of the war, was in command of the division disposed along the slopes of Mamayev Kurgan and alongside Bani Ovrag. Batyuk seemed glad of Krimov's visit. For supper, there was meat in aspic and a hot pie. As he poured out some vodka for Krimov, Batyuk narrowed his eyes and said, "I heard you were coming round giving lectures. I wondered who you'd visit first, me or Rodmitsev. In the end, you went to Rodmitsev's." He smiled at Krimov and grunted, "It's just like being in a village. As soon as things quieten down in the evening, we start phoning our neighbours. What did you have to eat? Has anyone been round? Are you going anywhere yourself? Did the high-up say which of us has got the best bathhouse? Has anyone been written about in the newspaper? Yes, they always write about Rodmitsev, never about us. To read the newspapers, you'd think he was defending Stalingrad all by himself." He gave his guests some more vodka, but himself just had some tea and a crust of bread. He seemed indifferent to the pleasures of the table. Krimov realized that the deliberateness of Batyuk's movements and his slow Ukrainian manner of speech were misleading. In fact, he was mulling over some very difficult problems. He was upset that Batyuk didn't ask a single question about his lecture. It was as though it bore no relation to any of Batyuk's real concerns. Krimov was appalled by what Batyuk told him about the first hours of the war. During the mass retreat from the frontier, Batyuk led his own battalion west to hold a ford against the Germans. His superior officers, retreating along the same road, thought he was about to surrender to the Germans. There and then, after an interrogation consisting only of hysterical shouts and curses, it was decided to have Batyuk shot. At the last moment, he was already standing against a tree. He was rescued by his own soldiers. "Yes, comrade Lieutenant Colonel," said Krimov. "That's no joke." "I didn't quite die of a heart attack," said Batyuk. "But my heart hasn't been the same since, that's for sure." "Can you hear the firing over in the market?" asked Krimov, in a rather theatrical tone. "Is Gorokhov up to something?" Batyuk glanced at him. "I know what Gorokhov's up to. He's playing cards." Krimov said he had heard there was going to be a meeting of snipers at Batyuk's. He'd like to attend. "Certainly," said Batyuk. "Why not?" They began to talk about the front. Batyuk said he was worried by the gradual build-up of German troops in the north of the sector. It was mostly taking place at night. Finally, the snipers assembled. Krimov realized who the pie was intended for. Men in padded jackets sat down one after another on benches beside the wall and round the table. They seemed shy and awkward, but at the same time conscious of their own worth. The new arrivals stacked their rifles and Tommy guns in the corner, trying to make as little noise as possible. They might have been workers putting down their axes and spades. The famous Zaitsev looked somehow kind and gentle, just a good-natured country lad. But when he turned his head and frowned, Krimov glimpsed the true harshness of his features. It reminded him of a moment at a conference before the war. Looking at an old friend seated beside him, he had suddenly seen this seemingly hard face in a different light. His eyes kept blinking, his mouth was half open, and he had a weak nose and chin. Altogether he seemed feeble and irresolute. Next to Zaitsev was Bezditko, a mortarman with narrow shoulders and brown laughing eyes, and Suleiman Kalimov, a young Uzbek with the thick lips of a child. There was Matsigur, a crack shot, who kept having to wipe the sweat off his forehead. He looked like a quiet family man, anything but a sniper. The other snipers, Shuklin, Tokarev, Manzulia, and Solodky, also looked like shy, diffident young lads. Batyuk cocked his head to one side as he questioned them. He looked more like an inquisitive schoolboy than one of the canniest and most experienced officers in Stalingrad. Everyone's eyes lit up when he started talking in Ukrainian to Bezditko. They were expecting some good jokes. "Well, Bezditko, how's it been?" "Oh, yesterday I gave the Fritzes a hard time, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel. You already know that, but today I only got 5. And I wasted 4 bombs. "Well, you're not in the same class as Shuklin. He put 14 tanks out of action with 1 gun. "Yes, and the gun was all that was left of his battery." "He blew up a German brothel yesterday," said the handsome Bulatov, blushing. "I just recorded it as an ordinary bunker." "Talking of bunkers," said Batyuk, "my door was smashed in yesterday by a mortar bomb." He turned to Bezditko and said reproachfully, "I thought that son of a bitch Bezditko was aiming a bit wide." Manzulia, a gun layer who seemed even quieter than the rest, took a piece of pie and murmured, "It's good pastry, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel." Batyuk tapped his glass with the rifle cartridge. "Well, comrades, let's get down to business." It was just another production conference, like those held in factories or village mills. Only the people here were not bakers, weavers, or tailors, nor were they talking of threshing methods or bread. Bulatov told them how he had seen a German walking down a path with his arm around a woman. He had made them drop to the ground. And then, before killing them, he had let them get up 3 times, only to force them back to the ground by stirring up clouds of dust an inch or 2 from their feet. He was bending down towards her when I finished him off. They ended up stretched across the path like a cross. Bulatov's nonchalance made this story particularly horrible. It was quite unlike most soldiers' tales. "Come on, that's enough of your bullshit, Bulatov," Zaitsev interrupted. "That takes my score to 78, said Bulatov. "And I'm not bullshitting. The commissar wouldn't allow me to lie. Here's his signature." Krimov wanted to join in the conversation. He wanted to say that among the Germans Bulatov had killed, there might well have been workers, revolutionaries, internationalists. It was important to remember this, or they'd become mere chauvinists. But he kept quiet. He knew that that kind of thinking was unhelpful, that it would serve only to demoralize the soldiers. The blonde Solodky said with a lisp that he had killed 8 Germans yesterday. He added, "I come from a kolkhoz near Umansk, where the fascists did in my village. It's unbelievable. And I haven't got free myself. I've been wounded 3 times. That's what made me a sniper." After suggesting very earnestly that it was best to pick a spot along a path the Germans used to fetch water or to go to the kitchen, Tokarev said, "I'm from Motsaev. My wife's in occupied territory. I got a letter from her saying what they've been through. They killed my son because of the name I gave him, Vladimir Ilyich." "I never hurry," said Kalimov excitedly. "I shoot when my heart tells me. I come to the front. Sergeant Gunov, my friend, he teach me Russian, I teach him Uzbek. Germans kill him. I kill 12 Germans. I take binoculars from officer, hang them round neck. I carry out your orders, comrade political instructor." There was something terrible about the reports of these snipers. Krimov had always scorned lily-livered intellectuals, people like Strom and Yevgenia Nikolaevna, who had made such a to-do over the fate of the kulaks. Referring to 1937, he had told Yevgenia, "There's nothing wrong with liquidating our enemies. That what's terrible is when we shoot our own people." Now he felt like saying that he had always, without hesitation, been ready to shoot White Guards, to exterminate Menshevik and SR scum, to liquidate the kulaks, that he'd never felt the least pity for enemies of the revolution, but that it was wrong to rejoice at the killing of German workers. There was something horrible about the way these soldiers talked, even though they knew very well what they were fighting for. Zaitsev began to tell the story of his battle of wits with a German sniper at the foot of Mamayev Kurgan. It had lasted for days. The German knew Zaitsev was watching him, and he himself was keeping watch on Zaitsev. They seemed well matched. Neither could catch the other out. He'd already picked off 3 of our men that day, but I just lay in my ditch. I didn't make a sound. Then he had one more go. His aim was perfect. Another of our soldiers fell to the ground with his hands in the air. One of their soldiers went by with some papers, and I just lay there and watched. I knew what he'd be thinking, that if I'd been around I'd have picked off that soldier. And I knew he couldn't see the soldier he'd shot himself. He'd want to have a look. Neither of us moved. Then another German went by with a bucket. Not a sound from my ditch. Another 15 minutes, and he started to get to his feet. He stood up. Then I stood up myself. Reliving what he'd been through, Zaitsev got up from the table. His face had now assumed the expression Krimov had earlier only glimpsed. now he was no longer just the good-natured young lad. There was something leonine, something powerful and sinister in his flared nostrils, in his broad forehead, in the triumphant glare of his eyes. He realized who I was, and then I shot him. There was a moment of silence, probably the same silence that had followed Zaitsev's shot. You could almost hear the dead body falling to the ground. Batyuk suddenly turned to Krimov and asked, "Well, do you find all this interesting?" "It's great stuff," said Krimov, and that was all he said. Krimov stayed behind after the end of the meeting. Batyuk moved his lips as he counted out some drops for his heart into an empty glass, and then he filled it with water. Yawning every now and then, he started to tell Krimov about everyday life in the division. Everything he said seemed to have some bearing on what had happened to him in the first hours of the war. It was as though all his thoughts had developed from that point. Ever since he had arrived in Stalingrad, Krimov had had a strange feeling. Sometimes it was as though he were in a kingdom where the party no longer existed. Sometimes he felt he was breathing the air of the first days of the revolution. "Have you been a member of the party for long, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel?" he asked Batyuk abruptly. "Why do you ask, Comrade Commissar? Do you think I'm deviating from the party line?" For a moment Krimov didn't answer. And then he said, "I've always been considered quite a good orator, you know. I've spoken at large workers' meetings. But ever since I arrived here, I've felt that I'm following people rather than guiding them. It's very odd. Just now I wanted to say something to your snipers, and then I thought they knew all they needed to know already. Oh, actually, that wasn't the only reason I didn't say anything. We've been told to make the soldiers think of the Red Army as an army of vengeance. This isn't the moment for me to start talking about internationalism or class consciousness. What matters is to mobilize the fury of the masses against the enemy. I don't want to be like the idiot in the story who began reciting the funeral service at a wedding." He thought for a moment. "Anyway, I'm used to it. The parties mobilized the fury of the masses in order to destroy the enemy, to annihilate them. There's no place for Christian humanitarianism now. Our Soviet humanitarianism is something more stern. We certainly don't wear kid gloves." He paused again. "Of course, I'm not talking about incidents like when you were nearly shot. And in 1937 there were times when we shot our own people. Yes, we're paying for that now. But now the Germans have attacked the homeland of workers and peasants. War's war. They deserve what they get." Krimov waited for a response from Batyuk, but it wasn't forthcoming. Not because Batyuk was perplexed by what he'd said, but because he'd fallen asleep. It was almost dark. Men in padded jackets were scurrying about between the furnaces of the Red October steelworks. In the distance you could hear shooting and see brief flashes of light. The air was full of a kind of dusty mist. Guriev, the divisional commander, had set up the regimental command posts inside the furnaces. Krimov had the impression that the people inside these furnaces that until recently had forged steel, must be very special, must themselves have hearts of steel. You could hear the tramp of German boots. You could hear orders being shouted out. You could even hear quiet clicks as the Germans reloaded their Tommy guns. As he climbed down, shoulders hunched, into the mouth of a furnace that was now the command post of an infantry battalion, as his hands felt the warmth that still lingered in the fire bricks, A sort of timidity suddenly came over Krimov. It was as though the secret of this extraordinary resistance was about to be revealed to him. In the semi-darkness he made out a squatting figure with a broad face, and heard a welcoming voice. "Here's a guest come to our palace! Welcome! Quick, some vodka, with a hard-boiled egg for our visitor." A thought flashed through Krimov's brain. He'd never be able to tell Yevgenia Nikolaevna how he had thought of her as he climbed into a dark, airless steel furnace in Stalingrad. In the past he'd tried to forget her, to escape from her, but now he was reconciled to the way she followed him wherever he went. The witch, she had even followed him into the furnace. He was all as clear as daylight. Who needed stepsons of the time? Better to hide them away with the cripples and pensioners, better to make them into soap. Her leaving him was just one more sign that his life was hopeless. Even here in Stalingrad, they didn't want him as a combatant. That evening, after his lecture, Krimov talked to General Guriev. Guriev had taken off his jacket and kept wiping the sweat off his red face. In the same harsh voice, he offered Krimov vodka, shouted orders down the telephone to his battalion commanders, abused the cook for failing to grill the shashliks correctly, and rang his neighbour, Batyuk, to ask if they were playing dominoes on Mamayev Kurgan. "We've got some good men here," said Guriev. "They're a fine lot. Batyuk's certainly got a head on his shoulders, and General Zlodyev at the tractor factory is an old friend of mine. And then there's Colonel Gutiev at the barricades, only he's a monk. He never drinks vodka at all. That really is a mistake." Then he told Krimov about how no one else had so few men as he did, between 6 and 8 in each company, and no one else was so cut off from the rear. When they sent him reinforcements, a third of them would arrive wounded. No one else, except perhaps Gorokov, had to put up with that. "Yesterday, Chuikov summoned Schubert, my chief of staff. They had a disagreement over the exact position of the front line. Poor Colonel Schubert came back in a terrible state." He glanced at Krimov. "Do you think Chuikov just swore at him?" He burst out laughing. "No, he gets sworn at by me every day. He came back with his front teeth knocked out." "Yes," said Krimov slowly. This "yes" was an admission that the dignity of man didn't always hold sway on the slopes of Stalingrad. Then Guriev held forth about how badly the war was reported in the newspapers. "Those sons of bitches never see any action themselves. They just sit on the other side of the Volga and write their articles. If someone gives them a good dinner, then they write about him. They're certainly no Tolstoys. People have been reading War and Peace for a century, and they'll go on reading it for another century. And why is that? Because Tolstoy's a soldier. Because he took part in the war himself. That's how he knew who to write about." "Excuse me, Comrade General," said Krimov. "Tolstoy didn't take part in the Patriotic War." "He didn't take part in it? What do you mean?" "Well, just that," said Krimov. "He didn't take part in it. He hadn't even been born at the time of the war with Napoleon." "He hadn't been born," said Guriev. "What do you mean? How on earth?" A furious argument then developed, the first to have followed any of Krimov's lectures. To his surprise, the general flatly refused to believe him. The divisional commander asked Major Byoroskin about the position with regard to House 6-1. Should they withdraw? Byoroskin advised against it, even though the building was indeed almost totally surrounded. It housed observation posts of great importance to the artillery on the left bank, and a sapper detachment able to prevent any further attacks by German tanks. The Germans were hardly likely to begin a major offensive without first liquidating this little pocket of resistance. Their tactics were predictable enough. and with a minimum support, the building might be able to hold out for some time and disrupt the German strategy. Since the telephone cable had been cut repeatedly, and since signallers were only able to reach the building during a few hours in the middle of the night, it would be worth sending a radio operator there. The divisional commander agreed, and during the night, political instructor Soshkin managed to get through to House 6-1 with a group of soldiers. They brought with them several boxes of ammunition, hand grenades, a radio set, and a very young operator, a girl. On his return the following morning, Soshkin said that the commander of the detachment holding the house had refused to write an official report. "I haven't got time for any of that rubbish," he had said. "I give my reports to the Fritzes." "I can't make head or tail of what's going on there," said Soshkin. "They all seem terrified of this Grekov, but he just pretends to be one of the lads. They all go to sleep in a heap on the floor, Grekov included, and they call him Vanya. Forgive me for saying so, but he's more like some kind of Paris commune than a military unit." Byoroskin shook his head. "So, you refuse to write a report? Well, he is a one." Pivovarov, the battalion commissar, then came out with a speech about people behaving like partisans. "What do you mean, like partisans?" said Byoroskin in a conciliatory tone. "It's just independence, a show of initiative. I often dream of being surrounded myself, so I could forget all this paperwork." "Oh, that reminds me," said Pivovarov. "You'd better write a detailed report for the divisional commissar." The divisional commissar took a serious view of all this. He ordered Pivovarov to obtain detailed information about the situation in House 6-1 and to give Grekov a good talking to, then and there. At the same time, he wrote reports to the member of the military soviet and to the head of the army political section, informing them of the alarming state of affairs, both morally and politically, in House 6-1. At army level, Soshkin's report was taken still more seriously. The divisional commissar received instructions to sort the matter out with the utmost urgency. The head of the army political section also sent an urgent report to the head of the political section for the front. Katya Vengrova, the radio operator, had arrived in House 6-1 during the night. In the morning she reported to Grekov, the house manager. As he listened, Grekov gazed into her eyes. They seemed confused, frightened, and at the same time mocking. She was round-shouldered, and she had a large mouth with pale, bloodless lips. Grekov paused for a moment when Katya asked if she could go. A number of different thoughts, all quite unrelated to the war, flashed through his head. By God, she's pretty. Nice legs. She looks frightened. I guess her mother's little girl. How old is she? 18 at the most. I just hope the lads don't all pounce on her. His final thought was quite unrelated to those that had gone before. Can't you see who's boss here? Haven't I driven those Fritzes up the wall? There isn't anywhere for you to go, Grekov said at last. Just stay by your transmitter. We'll find you something to send soon enough. He tapped the transmitter and glanced up at the sky where German dive bombers were whining and humming. Are you from Moscow? He asked. Yes. Now sit down. We're quite without ceremony here. It's like being in the country. Katya stepped to one side, crumbled brick squeaking beneath her heels. She could see the sunlight glinting on the machine gun barrels and on the dark metal of Grekov's German pistol. She sat down, looking at a pile of greatcoats beneath a ruined wall. For a moment she felt surprised that all this no longer surprised her. She knew that the machine guns in the breach in the wall were Degterev's, that the captured Walter took 8 bullets, that it was powerful but difficult to aim, that the greatcoats in the corner belonged to soldiers who had been killed, and that the corpses hadn't been buried very deep. The general smell of burning blended with another smell that had already become all too familiar. And her wireless set was just like the one she'd worked with in Kotluban, the same dial on the receiver, the same switch. She remembered the times in the steps where she had looked into the dusty glass of the ammeter and tidied her hair, smoothing it back under her cap. No one spoke to her. It was as though she had nothing to do with the wild and terrible goings-on around her. But when one grey-haired man started swearing, he seemed from the conversation to be a mortar man, Grekov chided, "Softly now! That's no way to speak in front of our girl." Katya winced, not because of the old man's foul language, but because of the way Grekov had looked at her. Even though no one said anything to her, she knew that the atmosphere had changed since her arrival. She could feel the tension with her skin, a tension that didn't evaporate even when they heard the whine of dive bombers, followed by explosions and a hail of broken brick. By now Katya had grown used to falling bombs and the whistle of shrapnel, but she felt as confused as ever by the heavy male looks that bore down on her here. The night before, the other girls had commiserated with her. "Oh, it sounds quite terrifying there," they had said. A soldier had taken her to regimental headquarters. She had sensed at once how close she was to the enemy, how fragile life had become. People themselves seemed suddenly fragile. Here 1 minute, gone the next. The officer in command had shaken his head sadly and said, "How can they send children like you to the front?" And then, "Oh, don't be frightened, my dear. If anything's not as it should be, just inform me over the radio." He had said this with such a kind fatherly voice that it was all she could do not to burst into tears. She had then been taken to battalion headquarters. They had a gramophone there. The commander, a redhead, offered Katya a drink and invited her to dance to a record of the Chinese serenade. The atmosphere there had been terrifying. Katya had felt that the commander was drinking not to enjoy himself, but simply to stifle some unbearable fear, to forget that his own life was now as fragile as glass. And now, here she was, sitting on a heap of bricks in house 6-1. For some reason she didn't feel any fear at all. Instead she thought of the wonderful fairy tale life she'd enjoyed before the war. The men in the surrounding building seemed extraordinarily strong and sure of themselves. This self-confidence was very reassuring, like that possessed by firemen, by tailors cutting some priceless cloth, by skilled workers in a metal rolling mill, by old teachers expounding beside their blackboards, by eminent doctors. Before the war, Katya had always believed that her life was doomed to be unhappy. When she'd seen friends of hers going anywhere by bus, she'd thought them spendthrifts. As for people coming out of restaurants, however bad, they seemed like fabulous beings. Sometimes she'd followed a little group on their way home from some Darial or Terek and tried to listen to their conversation. Returning home from school, she had announced solemnly, "Guess what happened today? A girl gave me some fizzy water with syrup, real syrup that tasted of blackcurrants." To live on what remained, after the deduction of income tax, cultural tax, and the state loan, of her mother's salary of 400 rubles, had been far from easy. Instead of buying new clothes, they'd always refashioned their old ones. The other tenants had paid Maryusia, the caretaker's wife, to clean the communal areas, but they had done their share themselves. Katya herself had cleaned the floors and carried out the rubbish. They'd bought milk at the state shop. The queues were enormous, but it saved them 6 rubles a month. If there wasn't any milk in the state shop, then Katya's mother had gone to the market late in the afternoon. The peasant women would be in a hurry to catch the evening train and would sell off their milk at almost the same price as in the state shop. They'd never travelled by bus, and they only went by train if they had to go a very long distance. Instead of going to the hairdresser's, Katya had always had her hair cut by her mother. They'd done their own laundry, and the light bulb in their room was almost as dim as those in the communal areas. They had cooked for 3 days at a time. They had soup, and sometimes kasha with a little oil. Once Katya had had 3 plates of soup, one after the other, and said, "Well, today we've had a 3-course meal." Her mother had never talked about how things had been while her father still lived with them. She herself couldn't remember. Once Vera Dmitrievna, a friend of her mother's, had watched the 2 of them preparing a meal and said, "Yes, we too had our hour of glory." This had made her mother angry. She hadn't allowed Vera Dmitrievna to enlarge on how things had been during their hour of glory. One day Katya had found a photograph of her father in a cupboard. It was the first time she'd seen a photograph of him, but she knew immediately who it was. On the back was written, "To Lida, I am from the tribe of Azra. When we love, we die in silence." She said nothing to her mother, but from then on, when she returned from school, she'd often take the photograph out and gaze for a long time into her father's dark, melancholy eyes. Once she'd asked, "Where's Papa now?" Her mother had just said, "I don't know." It was only when Katya left for the army that her mother at last told her about him. She learned that he had married again, and that he had been arrested in 1937. They had talked right through the night. Everything had been reversed. Her mother, usually so reserved, had told her how she'd been abandoned by her husband. She talked about her feelings of jealousy, of humiliation and hurt, of love and pity. Katya had been quite astonished. The world of the human soul suddenly seemed so vast as to make even the raging war seem insignificant. In the morning they had said goodbye. Her mother had drawn her head towards her, but the pack on her shoulders had pulled her away. Katya had said, "Mama, I'm from the tribe of Azra. When we love, we die in silence." Then her mother had gently pushed her away. "Go on, Katya, it's time you left." And Katya had left. Like millions of others, both young and old, she had left her mother's house, perhaps never to return, perhaps to return only as a different person, cut off forever from her harsh and beloved childhood. And now here she was, sitting next to Grekov, the house manager, looking at his large head, at his frowning face and thick lips. That first day, the telephone was still working. There was nothing for Katya to do. The feeling of being excluded from the life of the building became increasingly oppressive. Nevertheless, that day did much to prepare her for what lay in store. She learned that the observation post for the artillery on the left bank was situated in the ruins of the first floor. It was commanded by a lieutenant in a dirty tunic whose spectacles kept slipping down his snub nose. The angry old man, who swore a lot, had been transferred from the militia. He was very proud indeed to be in command of a mortar team. The sappers were installed between a high wall and a heap of rubble. They were commanded by a stout man who groaned and grimaced when he walked, as though he was suffering from corns. The single piece of artillery was in the charge of Kolomitsev, a bald man in a sailor's tunic. Katya had heard Grekov shout, "Kolomitsev, wake up! You've just slept through yet another golden opportunity." The infantry and the machine guns were commanded by a second lieutenant with a blonde beard. The beard made his face seem very young, though he no doubt imagined that it made him look mature, perhaps in his 30s. In the afternoon she was given something to eat, bread and mutton sausage. And then she remembered she had a sweet in her tunic pocket, slipped it quietly into her mouth. After that, in spite of the firing nearby, she felt like a nap. She soon fell asleep, still sucking her sweet. But even in her sleep she still felt a sense of anguish, of imminent disaster. Suddenly she heard a slow, drawling voice. Her eyes still closed, she listened to the words. "Past sorrow is to me like wine, stronger with every passing year." In this stone well, lit by the amber evening light, a dirty young man with dishevelled hair was sitting, reading out loud from a book. 5 or 6 men were sprawled around him on piles of red bricks. Grekov was lying on his overcoat, resting his chin on his fists. One young man, probably a Georgian, listened with an air of suspicion. It was as though he was saying, "Come on now, you won't get me to buy this rubbish." An explosion close by raised a cloud of dust. It was like something from a fairy tale. The armed men, sitting on blood-coloured bricks and surrounded by this red mist, seemed to have sprung from the Day of Judgment, recorded in the lay of Igor's campaign. And suddenly Katya's heart stirred in an absurd expectation of some future happiness. The following day an event took place which appalled even these hardened soldiers. The senior tenant on the first floor, Lieutenant Batrakov, had under his command an observer, Bunchuk, and a plotter, Lampasov. Katya saw them all several times a day. Sullen Lampasov, cunning, yet simple-hearted Bunchuk, and the strange lieutenant with glasses who was always smiling at his own thoughts. When it was quiet, she could even hear their voices through the hole in the ceiling. Lampasov had reared chickens before the war. He loved telling Bunchuk about the intelligent and treacherous ways of his hens. Peering through his telescope, Bunchuk would report in a sing-song voice, "Yes, there's a column of vehicles coming from Kalach. A tank in the middle. Some Fritzes on foot. A whole battalion. And then 3 field kitchens just like yesterday. I can see smoke, and some Fritzes with pans." Some of his observations were of greater human than military interest. "Now, there's a German officer going for a walk with his dog. The dog's sniffing a post. He probably wants to pee. Yes, it must be a bitch. The officer's just standing there. He's having a scratch. Now I can see 2 girls chatting to some Fritzes. They're offering the girls cigarettes. One of them's lit up, the other's shaking her head. She must be saying, 'I don't smoke.'" Suddenly, in the same sing-song voice, Bunchuk announced, "The square's full of soldiers. And a band. There's a stage in the middle. Oh, no, a pile of wood." He fell silent. Then, in the same voice, now full of despair, he went on, "Comrade Lieutenant, I can see a woman in a shift. She's being frog-marched. She's screaming. The band's struck up. They're tying the woman to a post. Comrade Lieutenant, there's a little boy with her. Aye, they're tying him up. Comrade Lieutenant, I can't bear to look. 2 Fritzes are emptying some cans of petrol." Batrakov hurriedly reported all this by telephone to the left bank. Then he grabbed the telescope himself. "Aye, comrades, the band's playing and the whole square's full of smoke. Fire!" he suddenly howled out in a terrible voice and turned in the direction of the left bank. Not a sound from the left bank. A few seconds passed. Then the place of execution was subjected to a concentrated barrage by the heavy artillery. The square was enveloped in dust and smoke. Several hours later they were informed by their scout, Klimov, that the Germans had been about to burn a gypsy woman and her son, whom they suspected of being spies. The day before, Klimov had left some dirty washing with an old woman who lived in a cellar, together with her granddaughter and a goat. He had promised to come back for it later, when it was ready. Now he intended to ask this woman what had happened to the two gypsies, whether they had been burned to death on the pyre or killed by the Soviet shells. Klimov crawled through the ruins along paths known to him alone, only to find that the old woman's dwelling had just been destroyed by a Russian bomb. There was nothing left of the old woman, her granddaughter, or the goat, or of Klimov's pants and shirt. All he found among the splintered beams and lumps of plaster was a kitten covered with dirt. He was in a pitiful state, neither complaining nor asking for anything, evidently believing that life was always just a matter of noise, fire, and hunger. Klimov had no idea what made him suddenly stuff the kitten into his pocket. Katya was astonished by the relations between the inmates of House 6-1. Instead of standing to attention to give his report, Klimov simply sat down next to Grekov. They then talked together like two old friends. Klimov lit up from Grekov's cigarette. When he had finished, Klimov went up to Katya. "Yes, my girl," he said, "life on this earth can be terrible." Under his heart-penetrating stare, Katya blushed, gave a sigh. Klimov took the kitten out of his pocket and placed it on a brick beside her. During the course of the day, at least a dozen men came up to Katya and started to talk about cats. Not one of them spoke about the gypsies, though they had all been deeply shocked. Some of them wanted a sentimental heart-to-heart conversation and spoke coarsely and mockingly. Others just wanted to sleep with her and spoke very solemnly without cloying politeness. The kitten trembled constantly, evidently in a state of shock. "You should do away with it right now," the old man in charge of the mortar said with a grimace, and then added, "You must pick off the fleas." Another member of the mortar crew, the handsome, swarthy Chensov, also a former member of the militia, urged, "Get rid of that vermin, my girl. Now if it were a Siberian cat—" The sullen Lyakov, a sapper with thin lips and an unpleasant-looking face, was the only man to be genuinely concerned about the kitten and indifferent to the charms of the radio operator. "Once, when we were in the steppe," he told her, "something suddenly hit me. I thought it must be a shell at the end of its trajectory, but guess what? It was a hare. He stayed with me till evening. Then things quietened down a bit and he left. Now, you may be a girl," he went on, "but at least you can understand. That's a 108mm. That's the tune of a Vanyusha. That's a reconnaissance plane flying over the Volga. But the poor stupid hare can't make out anything at all. He can't even tell the difference between a mortar and a howitzer. The Germans send up a flare and he just sits there and shakes. You can't explain anything to him. That's what makes me sorry for these dumb animals." Recognizing that he was in earnest, Katya responded in the same tone. "I don't know. Take dogs, for example. They can tell different planes apart. When we were stationed in the village, there was a mongrel called Curzon. When our ILs flew over, he just lay there without even raising his head. But as soon as he heard the whine of a Junkers, he went straight to his hiding place. He never once made a mistake." The air was rent by a piercing scream, a German Vanyusha. There was a metallic crash, a cloud of black smoke mixed with red dust, and a shower of rubble. A minute later, when the dust began to settle, Katya and Lyakov resumed their conversation, for all the world as though it was two different people who'd just fallen flat on their faces. The self-assurance of these soldiers seemed to have rubbed off on Katya. It was as though they were convinced that everything here, even the iron and stone, might be weak and fragile, but not they themselves. A burst of machine gun fire whistled over their heads, and then another. This spring we were stationed near Svitogorsk, Yakov told her. Once there was a terrible whistling right over our heads, but we couldn't hear any shots. We didn't know what on earth was happening. It turned out to be the starlings imitating bullets. The lieutenant had even put us on alert. They did it perfectly. When I was at home, said Katya, smiling, I imagined that war would be a matter of lost cats, children screaming, and blazing buildings, and that seems to be just how it is. The next man to approach her was the bearded Zubarev. Well, he asked sympathetically, and how's our little man with the tail? He lifted up the scrap of cloth that had been laid over the kitten. Poor little thing, you do look weak. As he said this, his eyes gleamed insolently. That evening, after a brief skirmish, the Germans managed to advance a short distance along the flank of the building. Now their machine guns covered the path leading back to the Soviet lines. The telephone link with battalion headquarters was severed again. Grekov ordered a passage to be blasted to link up with a nearby tunnel. We'll use the dynamite, said Antsiferov, the sergeant major, a stout man with a mug of tea in one hand and a sugar lump in the other. The other inmates were sitting in a pit at the foot of the main wall and talking. As before, no one mentioned the two gypsies. Nor did they seem worried at being encircled. This calm seemed strange to Katya. Nevertheless, she submitted to it herself. Even the dreaded word encirclement no longer held any terrors for her. Nor was she frightened when a machine gun opened up right next to them, and Grekov shouted, Fire! Fire! Look, they've got right in! Nor when Grekov ordered, Use whatever's to hand! Knives, spades, grenades! You know your job! Kill the bastards! Doesn't matter how! During the few quiet moments, the men engaged in a long and detailed discussion of Katya's physical appearance. The short-sighted Batrakov, who'd always seemed to live in another world, turned out to be surprisingly interested. All I care about are a woman's tits, he said. Kolometsev disagreed. He, in Zubarev's words, preferred to call a spade a spade. So have you talked to her about the cat, then? Asked Zubarev. Of course, said Batrakov. Even old Greybeard here's had a chat with her about that. The old man in command of the mortar spat, drew his hand across his chest. Really, I ask you, does she have what makes a woman a woman? He got particularly angry if anyone hinted that Grekov might have his eye on her. Well, of course, to us, even a Katya seems passable. In the country of the blind, she's got legs like a stork, no arse worth speaking of, and great cow-like eyes. Call that a woman? You just like big tits, Chensov retorted. That's an outmoded pre-revolutionary point of view. Kolomaitsev, a coarse, foul-mouthed man whose large bald head concealed many surprising contradictions, said, She's not a bad girl, but I'm very particular. I like 'em small, preferably Armenian or Jewish, with large, quick eyes and short hair. Zubarev looked thoughtfully at the dark sky crisscrossed by the beams of searchlights. Well, I wonder how it'll work out in the end. You mean, who she'll end up with? Said Kolomitsev. Grekov, that's obvious. Far from it, said Zubarev. It's not in the least obvious. He picked up a piece of brick and hurled it against the wall. The others laughed. I see. You're going to charm her with the down on your chin, are you? Said Batrakov. No, said Kolomaitsev. He's going to sing. They're going to make a programme together. Infantry at the microphone. He'll sing. She'll broadcast it into the ether. They'll make a fine pair. Zubarev looked round at the boy who'd been reading poetry the evening before. And how about you? If he doesn't say anything, it's because he doesn't want to, said the old greybeard warningly. Then he turned to the boy and said in a fatherly way, as though he were rebuking his son for listening to the grown-ups, "You'd do better to go down to the cellar and get some sleep while you can." "And Sifarov's down there right now with his dynamite," said Batrakov. Meanwhile, Grekov was dictating to Katya. He informed army headquarters that the Germans were almost certainly preparing an offensive and that it would almost certainly be directed at the tractor factory. What he didn't say was that House 6-1 appeared to lie on the very axis of this offensive. But as he looked at Katya's thin little neck, at her lips, at her half-lowered eyelashes, he saw an all too vivid picture of a broken neck, with pearly vertebrae poking out through lacerated skin, of two glassed-over fish-like eyes, and of lips like grey, dusty rubber. He was longing to seize hold of her, to feel her life and warmth while they were both alive, while this young being was still full of grace and charm. He thought it was just a pity that made him want to embrace the girl. But does pity make your temples throb and your ears buzz? Headquarters was slow to answer. Grekov stretched till every joint in his body began to crack, gave a loud sigh, thought, "It's all right, we got the night ahead of us," and asked tenderly, "How's Klimov's kitten getting on? Is he getting his strength back?" "Far from it," answered Katya. She thought about the gypsies on the bonfire. Her hands were shaking. She glanced at Grekov to see if he'd noticed. Yesterday she'd thought that no one in this building was ever going to talk to her. Today, the bearded second lieutenant, Tommy gun in hand, had rushed by as she was eating her kasha and called out, as though they were old friends, "Don't just pick at it, Katya!" He had gestured at her to show how she ought to plunge her spoon into the pot. She'd seen the boy who had read the poem yesterday carrying some mortar bombs on a tarpaulin. Later she'd looked round and seen him standing by the water boiler. Realizing he was watching her, she'd looked away, but by then he had already turned away himself. She already knew who would start showing her letters and photographs tomorrow, who would look at her in silence and sigh, who would bring her a present of half a flask of water and some rusks of white bread, who would say he didn't believe in women's love and would never fall in love again. As for the bearded second lieutenant, he would probably start pawing her. Finally, an answer came through from headquarters. Katya started to repeat the message to Grekov. "Your orders are to make a detailed report every day at 1200 hours precisely." Grekov suddenly knocked Katya's hand off the switch. She let out a cry. He grinned and said, "Oh, a fragment from a mortar bomb has just put the wireless set out of action. Contact will be re-established when it suits Grekov." Katya gaped at him in astonishment. "I'm sorry, Katyusha," said Grekov, and took her by the hand.